event. This is Podcasting Smarter's April live event, New and Noteworthy, Hacking the Algorithm of Podcast Directories. My name is Norma Jean Belenke. I'm the head of events here at Podbean, and we are so excited you're joining us here today. So I'm joined here by our Director of Communications, Shannon Martin, and we'll get into it in a minute. Before we start, I just want to welcome everyone and say that if you have any questions, please drop them here in the comments, and our team here at Podbean will address any questions you have about the subject matter. And you can also hit us up at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. So if you have any podcasting questions, feel free to write in to the team here at Podbean, and hopefully we'll get them on the podcast. So hello, Shannon. Hello and welcome.
Hi, exciting topic for the day.
Yes, new and noteworthy. So before we get started, I just want to lay the groundwork for everybody out there in terms of the terms that we use, because podcasting is such a new medium. And when we say podcast directories, can you just
Mhm.
explain a little bit about what that means? Because we have our own at Podbean,
Yes.
but there are so many out there, and there's quite a few popular ones.
Yeah, many people will think of it as a listener, you'll think of it as the apps that you listen on. And so now we still use that term directory, and a lot of them are web-based and an app. Podbean, you can go to podbean.com and look them up, but you're probably listening in an app. So these are the apps that are out there: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, Podcast Addict, any of the apps that you may use. And some of them actually pull the podcasts from Apple Podcasts, so some of the smaller apps, and others have their own directory, like a Podbean or a Spotify does. So those directories are, where people find your podcast, basically. And your hosting platform is what gets it out to those. But those are the endpoints where people listen. And sometimes when people first get into podcasting, they don't realize that they don't directly upload to those platforms. So they think, oh, how do I upload my podcasts to Apple Podcasts? But you use a hosting partner and have an RSS feed, and then it's submitted and goes out through all those directories. So that's kind of the how podcasting works 101, very basic.
Yes, absolutely. So when we say directory, we mean an app like the Podbean app where you would listen to podcasts, or an Apple Podcast, Spotify, that kind of thing. So within the industry, we call them podcast directories. So just for note before we jump in, and a lot of these directories have algorithms. And so today we're going to talk about hacking the algorithm and getting into what in Apple Podcasts called new and noteworthy. And that's really pretty much being featured within that app or directory for your podcast. So, Shannon, start us off a little bit with what is new and noteworthy?
Yeah, so New and Noteworthy is the name of this in Apple Podcasts. And as you mentioned, there are lots of directories, and a lot of them will have something similar. So there's going to be a combination, and we're going to get into the details and how they're done, even though, like all directories, most of the us and them don't share the exact details of algorithmic things and
Right.
picking, but they're all pretty much some combination of editorial, sort of hand picking, curating, and some algorithmic factors. But New and Noteworthy is kind of your splash page on Apple Podcasts, or a lot of people think of it as iTunes. And that is, so when you go in, there's this kind of, section, and it highlights these new and noteworthy, new or noteworthy. We'll talk about that podcast. And there's
Mhm.
also different sections, different categories, different, Apple has what's hot, I think is another one. And in Podbean, for example, we have banners that we run across the top that feature kind of that's kind of our real, vibrant, visible section, when you go in. But then we also have featured podcasts and obviously the categories. So there's that kind of thing. But new and noteworthy is Apple's, and you'll hear it a lot. You'll hear a lot of people mention it. There's a lot of misconceptions around it, and a lot of strategies to try and hack it. But we'll kind of talk about why good principles of podcasting are more important than hacking any kind of algorithm.
Right. Despite, I mean, we all want to know how to hack it, Shannon. Um, but I think it's also important to mention that when we're talking about podcast directories and being featured in podcast directories, it's especially important as podcasters, because in terms of the overall promotion of promoting your podcast, when you promote in app, whether you get featured, whether you're featured on a banner, whatever that specific promotion is, it's so exponentially helpful for your podcast because that's where people are listening to podcasts anyways. And so it's not like maybe on social media, maybe on Twitter, somebody recommends a podcast, but not everybody on Twitter is a podcast listener. So you're directly getting that promotion where podcast listeners are hanging out. So I just wanted to mention that as well. So before we jump in a little bit, Shannon, tell us a little bit about the importance and how these features can make or break a podcast.
Well, I think it's, you're when you're shown in an app, it's definitely really something that's, can be very valuable. But I will say, in the long term, there's a lot of variation in how it kind of impacts a podcast and different directories, different apps, different things. I think if you could go in and be, featured across a whole lot of apps, and have guests promote you into all of this stuff, you would have a lot of benefit from it. But you also have to remember that that gets you visibility, basically. So that's what it does for you, and that's great, and it's important. And you can also say, oh, we were featured in this place or that, but it doesn't necessarily get you the long-term audience. So I might see something there and then listen, but if the content, it doesn't turn out to be compelling. So this is what's the reason I mentioned this is why Podbean or Apple Podcasts or any directory wants to feature good quality content there. They don't want there to be an easy hack that puts in low quality stuff somehow by just doing some tricky kind of thing. It's very much like Google. When you use Google, the reason we all are using Google to search mostly nowadays, and some other search directories that we may have used in the past are not around any longer, is because Google does a good job surfacing the content that we need. And so Apple wants to keep this being exciting content interesting to you. So I just will say, I think there's many ways you can be featured, and word of mouth is really important in podcasting. But also, we'll talk about how you really have to focus on the content and the audience. And that's also going to really help with potentially getting featured places.
Absolutely. And, we always say this at Podbean, content is king. So we're talking about how you can, hack the algorithm and really get a lot of this featured promotion within podcast directories and apps. And the reason a lot of directories promote and feature podcasts is because they believe in the content. They see the work and they're excited about it too. So that's definitely an important aspect to add. And a lot of directories don't disclose how their algorithms work, especially Apple, which is kind of the gold standard in podcasting. And, as an industry, podcasting really blew up a lot because of how Apple included the podcast app on all the phones, on all the iPhones. So,
Yeah,
it's something
definitely.
that really helped a lot of people discover what a podcast was. So I think that's a really big aspect of it. So Shannon, at Podbean, we host over 600,000 podcasts. We host a lot of podcasts at
Mhm.
Podbean, and some of them have gotten a lot of these features and received this promotion, which, like you mentioned, it doesn't help unless the content's there, but it can give such a big boost.
Mhm.
What are some of the commonalities that we've seen in terms of some podcasts that have achieved this boon?
Yeah, so I think there's some really important basics, and actually, we will put in the show notes. There are a few links directly from Apple Podcasts that explain to you things that you need to have in place in order to be. So right off the bat, if you want to be included, if your content it has a lot of sound issues, if your artwork has a lot of problems, all of these kind of things, you will not get included. So those are going to be things. There's some basics that you really have to cover. So
Yeah.
there's some interesting things with New and Noteworthy. What Again, they don't disclose the algorithm, but the algorithmic side of it, which is only one piece, seems to be mainly based around recent listens or recent downloads. So if the thing about New and Noteworthy is it's not only new, it's new and noteworthy. So there is a big myth out there that you have to get featured in your first 8 weeks that you're out. So there's all these tricks and techniques and things like that. But if you have, for example, we're featuring a podcast at Podbean right now, which is a reporter on the ground in Ukraine. And they pitched me, and I was like, wow, that's super relevant. People want to know what's going on. This is something that we definitely want to feature.
Yeah.
And let's say that was a different podcast before, and now that was what they were focusing on, we still would have been interested because it's extremely relevant. So Apple is looking for things that are relevant, interesting to a wide audience, this kind of stuff. So there's an algorithmic piece and a curation piece. Algorithmically, if you're getting a lot of attention, which really means downloads and listens, and possibly new subscribers, ratings and reviews, which you will hear 100% of the time on podcasts, that they want you to rate and review because it'll help them be found in Apple Podcasts, are possibly a small factor, not nearly the emphasis that you hear people say. I'm not saying don't get ratings and reviews. I'm just saying that does not appear to be a big part of the algorithm. There are definitely lots of podcasts featured that don't have many reviews. There's been some in there that have had virtually none, I think. So that's overemphasized. That's a bit of a myth. You don't need to be, again, in your first 8 weeks, but you
Yeah.
have to have some noteworthy content. But there's that piece where they pick up on stuff. So that's where the numbers and that come in, where they see, oh, wow, this podcast is getting so many listens or whatever. Let's take a look at it, see if it should be featured. But at the same time, you can submit to Apple a request to be featured. So that's the link we'll drop in the show notes, and it tells you what you need to have in place. It tells you what they're looking for, and of course, they're looking for relevant, timely, interesting content that is going to appeal to a wide audience. If it's super niche, they may not be focusing it in the overall new and noteworthy, but maybe there's a reason why it's very timely now. But they're looking for something, that people are going to be interested in. And so you have to follow, kind of their standards, and then you can pitch them. And what you don't want to do is obviously have poor content and pitch them, or have okay content, but, send a pitch to Apple every week trying to get your podcast in, without kind of any relevant information. So
Right.
pitching Apple and other directories is something that, most of them have a content team that will take these pitches. So the people we have seen being featured have often done that. Or sometimes they've gotten in because they've gotten, as I said, those tremendous amount of downloads and listens right at a specific time or at the beginning on launch. And that
Yeah.
often happens because they have done a lot of work around promotion, and maybe they've even built an existing audience and done a lot of promotion ahead of time to drive a lot of attention to the podcast. So really exciting launch plan can help you with that, of course. So that's the way to get those, the attention from the numbers, I think, is to really drive that launch pad. Email out to your whole list, really, get it out there and get people interested. That's kind of the main thing. But just getting ratings and reviews is probably not going to do it for you if all the other pieces aren't there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something where it's something to strive for. It's kind of, in my mind, I think of it as like the cherry on top of a really good launch strategy. Right? So you've got all the different elements and aspects of a good launch strategy. Maybe like you're building like a big ice cream sundae or a banana split or something, right? And then, if you get that new and noteworthy, it's that cherry on top. It's nice to have, but it's the Sunday's okay without it. And I think part of a larger launch strategy, there's a couple of things that really, are factors when getting featured within a podcast directory. And I want to dive into a few of those. When launching a podcast, the number of episodes is a really important factor. So let's talk about that for a minute, because when people launch podcasts, when podcasters launch podcasts, it's something where, we're also excited, right? The impetus is to put that first episode out, to just get that very first one out. And that may not always be the best strategy. So can you talk a little bit about the number of episodes that it's important to have, and some things that we can all do around that launch strategy of a podcast?
I mean, you'll hear a lot of talk about, particularly around this new and noteworthy topic, around having three or 10, you'll hear episodes, that's part of like this hacking system, which actually there's been a fair bit of research that shows that's not actually the case. So I'd say focus on having what you can get with quality. I
Yeah.
know when I go to a podcast, I do like to see a few episodes because I like to kind of binge listen. So think about that. I would suggest not launching with 10 necessarily. Again, you'll hear all kinds of strategies. I'm just saying from seeing a lot of things, what I've seen, the launching with the working on too many and launching with too many, the problem with that is that almost everyone that does a podcast, even very, very professionally put together, maybe very professionally produced is maybe one exception. But anyone that hasn't had a ton of experience with podcasting, and even if they have, will tell you that from episode 1 to episode 25, there was drastic improvement. Excuse me.
Yes.
And
This is something we
so,
talk about all the time. Yes.
yeah, so recording, because you think you're going to hack an algorithm, so recording and doing
Yeah.
10 and putting them out there without that potential room for improvement, I don't think is the best strategy. Again, it's like,
Yeah.
what is the focus? Also, there's no room for you to get listener feedback, right? If you've already recorded your entire podcast. Now, again, not saying it really depends on the podcast and the situation, but in most cases, going with a smaller amount and then building up, maybe having a few episodes for them to binge. But I've heard a couple studies that people have done about their different, and I don't know that we've pulled data on our Podbean podcast, but I've seen a couple things out there from different podcasters that looked at testing different things out, and a lot of them found that actually launching with less episodes, they were fine with New and Noteworthy. So again, I think it's a bit of a myth that you have to have a certain number of episodes or be out in eight weeks. The reason why launching with a few episodes, the reason why that's out there is kind of a little bit of a myth, is that obviously if someone finds your podcast and there's multiple episodes and they listen, those number of downloads in those 24 hours is higher. And so that's where when we talked about the Apple looking at, number of downloads, number of listens in a 24-hour or very short period, which seems to be currently a big factor in their algorithm, then obviously that can help you with that piece. But let's look at it this way. If we have this amazing podcast that comes out about, I don't know, a new movie that's coming out, and millions of people are excited about it and download it, and they only have one episode, versus, I don't know, a podcast about something that's a little more niche, and I put out 3, 4, 5 episodes or whatever, and I get a nice number, like 5,000-6,000 downloads, which would probably be great for a niche podcast, and I put out 3 episodes, I'm still not competing with that 1 million. So again, we have to weigh these factors out and how we do it. I am a huge advocate, though, for when you're getting started, definitely banking some episodes, especially if
Yes.
you're doing interviews, because life happens. So I think preparing and getting some interviews there, and then you still have room to play with things. If you have that, you could still potentially go, oh, that one, move that around, do some more editing, things like that. But you've bought yourself some time, and that way you can be consistent for your listeners. So I think that's a good piece of advice when getting started.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's good to have a couple episodes out because, for the sole reason that if somebody likes your content, as a listener, and a podcaster, as a listener and a podcaster, it's when you like a show, you want to listen to a couple episodes. You want to dig in and, really have a real experience with that podcast. And sometimes one episode can feel a bit like a taster.
Yeah, it's a funny thing because we had Serial, which was a serial podcast,
Yes.
and that's how TV shows all used to be, right? But now we're so used to the binge concept. And when Serial did their second one, if I'm not incorrect, they did it in a binge style. They put them all out, I think. And
I believe so.
I
I'm not
think for the
100%. Yeah.
second, yeah, I think, and I mean, and it's really true. We've become sort of spoiled by that Netflix binge culture situation, and so
Yeah.
I agree personally. When I find a podcast, I usually do download a bunch of them, and then if it's funny because I wonder why sometimes I do that, because I don't need to, I don't necessarily, I
Yeah.
could go back and get it later, but I feel like, oh, I want to check this all out. And yeah, when it comes to TV shows nowadays, when something comes out that's only a serial, I often
Yeah.
wait. I wait until later. So,
Well, that's
yeah,
that's
I
definitely
definitely.
some self-control. I feel like we're in the age of the binge, I think, or I think everyone's attention span is shorter with social media and all of that.
Right.
But it's definitely something where it's helpful, when you like a podcast or to retain your audience, it's helpful
Yeah.
to develop and build that relationship as fast and as soon as you can. And for those podcasters that whose podcasts have already come out, right? They've got
Mhm.
maybe a season or 2 under their belt. How do they get back in? How do they relaunch their season and hit these algorithms?
Yeah, well, the good news is with new and noteworthy in particular, it is new and noteworthy, so you don't have to be brand new. The myth of the 8 weeks is not
Yeah.
true. So you have opportunities. So if you're going to do a new launch season, that's a great time to pitch yourself, to say we have this exciting new season coming out about so and so, and you should have a content catalog that you can show what you've done. You can tell Apple what your plans are at, assuming we're talking about new and noteworthy, what your plans are for launching and what you're how you're marketing it and all of that. So once again, have a new season launch plan, build excitement around it, try to get attention to it, put it out to your current, build excitement with your current listeners, your current audience, and social media and all of that. And that can also be true for just an episode. So if you don't do seasonal podcasts, but you're going to have a big interview coming on, that can be a reason to pitch new and noteworthy or Podbean or any directory. We get that quite a bit where someone will say, I'm interviewing the president, or I'm interviewing the CEO of this large corporation, or there's this big controversy, so I have this controversial kind of guest on, or whatever. And we get those editorial pitches a lot. And timely things are what podcast directories are also looking for. So if you have something like that, feel free to use that. Like I said, don't pitch Apple every week, but pitch them selectively. And if it's something where you were new and noteworthy when you were brand new, and you were a good quality podcast, and now you have this big guest coming up in a few weeks, that's a good time to do a pitch to them.
Absolutely. And, we kind of touched on artwork. I'm going to pivot a little bit. We kind of touched on
Mhm.
artwork a little bit, but what are some tips and best practices around podcast graphics and the artwork for our shows that can really help make the difference?
Yeah, Apple has very specific information that we'll link to in the show notes about what you
Yeah.
need graphic wise, and they need more graphics when you're pitching yourself to promote. Similarly, Podbean, if we are going to put you in the banner in Podbean, it's not the same as a podcast logo. It's a banner size, so it's a horizontal. So we need that artwork. And
Yeah.
I'll give you some ideas from our perspective because I get those pitches. The banner
Yeah.
artwork is, think of it like a logo, even though it's a different orientation. It's not meant to be, you're not meant to stuff it with a whole lot of words because it's an
Yeah.
app. So it has to look attractive in a podcast app. So good graphic design is really important, that it's attractive to the listener, that it kind of, gives them a glimpse into what the show might be or has something recognizable, but then it's not, a written description of a podcast, or,
Right.
having other call. It's not meant to have other calls to action, like go to so-and-so website or anything like that on there. It's very clean, minimal design, very much like you would look at your podcast logo, and clean, visually appealing with a lot of space, and those kind of things are really important. But yeah, Apple gives you very specifics on what they need, and we can give you the specs of ours because it's different than the logo if we have that. So we need that when we decide if we're going to pitch or decide if we're going to feature it in the banner or not.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to kind of niche it down even more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because the next thing I want to talk about is titles.
Mm-hmm.
So podcast titles are something where, it seems simple, but it can complicate things.
Yeah, I think both artwork and title are things that I'm really glad we're talking about this because we're
Yeah.
kind of saying we're talking about hacking directories, but I
Yeah.
really I love that because I think it's fun to talk about hacking it, but it's really hacking always implies that you're doing these tricky things. And then the important thing is
Yeah.
that's not really what works. The important thing is the foundational stuff that's going to help your podcast is what works. And it's also
Yeah.
what will do your podcast the most good in the long term. So having good artwork, investing in that, I think it's not that expensive nowadays. But if you don't have graphic design expertise, it may be worth investing some money in having someone help you with your graphics so that they're attractive. Because I know for me, I'm a word person. I can give an article, but when it comes to creating that graphic for that thing, I know there's folks that do it better than I do. So I think that creating those attractive, because what you have to remember is when I'm looking in a podcast app, that's what I'm going to see. Your title and your artwork. And very often people have artwork that really is not high quality, or also it just really, there's a popularity in putting your face on it, which works in certain cases, but is often not the best thing to portray what your podcast is all about. I think it's fun to look at some of the big podcasts out there and the popular ones, and some of the big players in podcasting, the big networks, and see, because they obviously have teams of designers, and see kind of what they're doing with their artwork, because you'll notice some commonalities. And if you talk to graphic designers, they'll probably mention the same things. Constantly, people are asking for feedback on graphics in different podcasting groups I'm part of. And one of
Yeah.
the things that almost always comes up is that person is trying to put too much in there. They want to have their name in it. They want to have their face and their name and the podcast title and maybe some other little element. And then you're looking at it on, let's say, a Facebook group, and it's already kind of a smaller picture, but it's still tons bigger than it's going to be when I look at it in my app. And so almost always the feedback is size it into the app and then see if you still like your artwork, because you're not going to
Yeah.
see, because a lot of times they'll have their name written really small, at the bottom. And I'll say, I can't even read it now on my
Yeah.
computer. And it's 4 times as big as it's going to be in my app. I'll never see that. So you might as well take it off. You can use that in the other graphics that you use. You have different size graphics that you'll use for social media, but for the podcast app. And for titles, it's very similar. What are people going to know what that means when they see it? It
Right,
doesn't
and you want
necessarily.
it to be something that people can remember
Right.
and that people can search for. I think that's also important.
Exactly. It's not to say that creative titles aren't sometimes useful. And if you're doing maybe a really creative audio drama or kind of thing, that may not be as descriptive. There are those kinds of situations where it's not so much descriptive, but I'd say in many, many cases, the first thing to go to is to be pretty descriptive in your title, to be simple and descriptive. For search, especially in podcast apps versus a more complicated Google search, but for searching in podcast apps, the title of the podcast overall and the title of the episode, those are the two things universally that podcast apps put into their search algorithm. For most of them, that's all they put in. So all those descriptions and all those keywords and stuff, that's going to be starting to be more and more important with Google Podcasts, and even Apple Podcasts is starting to potentially use some transcription kind of things behind the scenes to kind of contextually search more. So we will see this evolving, but for now, if someone not Google, so someone Podbeans or Apple Podcasts,
Searches, right, yeah.
yeah, in there, they're in there and they're like, oh, I want to find blah blah blah. They're only going to find you if those kind of keywords are in your title. It doesn't matter if it's in your descriptions and stuff right now. So again, for the most part. So depending on the type of podcast and what it is, thinking about what those keywords are. And of course, also looking at what's out there and making sure you don't take someone else's title, and looking at your websites and all of that. Do your homework
Yeah.
before you pick a
Yeah,
title.
absolutely, and I think it's something where it's so important if you have an idea for a podcast, for anybody out there who's still in the discovery phase of doing your research, or for any podcasters out there that are looking to start additional podcasts, it's something where it's so important to search that podcast title. In multiple directories, search the domain name, search social media, make sure that you're not going to confuse it with somebody else's, business or club or Facebook group or whatever it is.
That's
You want to
really
be able
it's
to have that name be yours. And domain names are also a really big aspect of that, because when you're looking for a domain name, it'll tell you if you can buy it or not. So
yeah, for hundreds of thousands of dollars, or if it's
right,
available. Yeah, so
right,
that's
exactly.
it's really important to do that homework on it and think about it. And if you have an existing audience, so if you're going from having some kind of following, or you have a business currently, you can also do some testing with your existing audience. Ask them, hey, I'm starting a podcast. Here's what I'm thinking about calling it. Here's my artwork. Do a little contest. Give them a prize. If they give you some feedback or vote on it, or that kind of thing, and try to find out what appeals to them. But I think, yeah, my advice would always be being descriptive and using those keywords in your titles when it makes sense. So generally,
Absolutely.
that's something important.
Absolutely. And I think involving your audience, if you have an existing audience, this is only, if you have a community and, you post on
Mhm.
Facebook to the people that you know, or LinkedIn if it's a professional podcast, or podcast on professional content. Um, it's so important, because when people feel like they have a stake in something, they're more likely to check out that first episode. They're more likely to subscribe, to listen, to be on your team, and join your club. Join your audience. So I think that's such an important aspect. Yeah, and Shannon, I think we've covered quite a bit. So I want to kind of go over. I want to go over a few of the tips that we spoke about. Um, and then we'll move on. But we just covered quite a bit. And when we say hacking the algorithm, hacking hacking the algorithm, it's not one big thing. It's really so many little things that make a world of difference. Right? It's something where those little details, whether it's the quality of your artwork, your search term, adhering to guidelines, requesting to be featured, the making sure your artwork is even up to specs. And even on a base level, making sure your podcast is distributed to those directories, right?
Absolutely. I was going to say that's the first thing to kind of start with is you can't
Yes.
be featured in a Noteworthy if you're not in Apple. And this is a good time actually to make sure to say this when you're planning a launch. We talked about number of
Yes.
episodes and what all to have. But another thing that I run across people not knowing all the time is they'll say, oh, I want to do a June 15th, launch or whatever. That's our date. And we're going to splash it out to everybody. We're going to share it. And so, like, for instance, with us, they're starting a Podbean account. They'll say, so let's start our account on June 15th or June 13th, 15th, 14th or whatever.
Mhm.
And I'll
Yeah.
say, no, no, no. It's probably, first of all, you need to play around with your hosting account and know how you're, navigating everything. But
Yeah, for
also
sure.
Apple requires you to have one episode live before they even approve you. Now it can be a trailer, but you can't, and they can sometimes take a few days to approve. Generally, it's about 24 hours, but you can't count on if you have that date in mind, you can't literally launch that date. You can't send it ahead of time to Apple. Oh, I'm going to have this podcast, so that they can pre-approve you. You have to have one episode or a trailer up. So just keep that in mind as far as timing goes. And you obviously can't be a new and Noteworthy or even in the directory at all if if you don't submit. And with Apple and many directories, what you'll do is you'll have your hosting platform, you'll get all set up, and then you do an initial submission to the directory. So they basically go through and approve it. And then all of your episodes from there on out, you're just publishing in Podbean or your hosting platform, and they're automatically pushed out or pulled actually from those directories. So,
Via the
it's kind
RSS
of,
feed. Right. That's how
yeah.
the
So
RSS feed works.
it's a bit of a one-time setup. Sometimes people think that that's all going to be automated initially from the hosting platform, but this way you're kind of the owner of your Apple Podcasts account. You can deal with any problems, changes, etc. Instead of the hosting platform. Kind of if we were submitting all those directly, that would be kind of the issue there. And then
Right. And if you
any
move from another host, if you're hosted with a different
Mhm,
organization and you're looking to move over to Podbean, you can easily
mhm.
do that because you
Yeah.
own your Apple Podcast account and all of that. So it's definitely something as a creator to own that. And I do also think that it's important to remember somebody on the Apple side, a human being, is checking a box and making sure that, your podcast is what it says it is. Um, and like you mentioned, Shannon, trailers have a lot of value. So, yes, I want to circle back to that. Yes, podcast trailers, whether it's for your launch of your show, the initial big, we're here, or whether it's for, a season launch or a series within your show, or a special episode, like you were saying.
And it's a good thing we talk about when you're pitching different directories and even
Yeah,
media, whatever you may be
yeah,
pitching, the trailer can be a nice fit for that, especially if you don't have episodes live. It's a way for people to hear, oh, there's good sound quality here. This is interesting. This is a teaser that
yeah,
made me interested. So it's really useful for that. So just always think about, how it will come across to anyone that you might be pitching, whether it's a directory or media or just even the listener that comes across your show. But that's important. The setting up is so key because we're way ahead of ourselves on all this. If you're listening to this, watching this, listening to this, and you're really trying to figure out how to get into a Noteworthy, how to get tops of all these directories, but you haven't
yeah.
done the basic setup, or you're not even in the directories yet, that's step one. So start there for sure.
Yes, absolutely. And trailers really offer a tremendous opportunity to introduce your show, whether it's audio cues, whether it's, I want to say quote unquote the vibe, but definitely the content, hosts, the subject matter, and it really gives the opportunity to get people excited for your podcast, which is such an important aspect of podcasting because you want your listeners to really, crave that next episode or get excited about when, the new episode comes out and debuts. So it's such an important aspect, I think, as well. And I don't think trailers have been around, since the beginning. So it's something where
Yeah, I mean, people could always do a trailer, but there's an actual official thing. So there's a tag
right,
now in Apple that kind of, and so it lines it up nicely. So before you could have one technically, I think we
right.
always recommended maybe people do people called it an intro episode or an
Yeah.
episode zero. A lot of
Right,
that's been around for a
exactly.
while. But yeah, Apple when a couple years back when they did new things with with seasons as well, with
Yeah.
having that ability to launch things seasonally. That was all part of that new Apple specs.
Absolutely. And I think it's something where it's really interesting as podcasters because we get to see how when something becomes popular enough, the industry and the big players and the technology evolves to enable that, right? So many people did an introduction episode. I mean, yeah, I almost every episode of like almost every podcast that I've listened to, if you scroll, if you with your thumb further back enough, you'll find it if it's a podcast that's been around quite a bit. If they haven't deleted it, you'll find that episode. And I think nowadays it's becoming easier and easier, and these features are really built in, and not just within hosts, but within different directories as well, which is so important. So the value of that trailer, it's free advertising. You make it great, and when we say audio cues, that's if you have any theme music, if you have any transitions, any kind of auditory signatures that your audience is going to define your podcast with, right? They're going to be able to subconsciously or consciously identify your podcast through those auditory cues. So that's also so important. Um, yeah, absolutely, Shannon. And yeah, trailers. I love them. And sometimes I'm just gonna admit something. I really like podcast trailers, and because the editing is so important on them, and they're so if you get a good one, and you work really hard on it, they're so well done. It's almost like a movie trailer. You're getting that kind of excitement.
Yeah, it should. I mean, it should be. You should think about it that way. It's your introduction. It's like first impressions, all the old cliches about first impressions. That's
Yeah.
very much true with a podcast. If people come into it, that's the chance to get them excited. And that's another thing that I think in talking about this subject, we won't delve a lot. We have other episodes of Podcasting Smarter and of our
Yeah.
different live streams coming up on promotion. But I think it's really important to understand putting together a promotion and launch plan, knowing that
Yes.
these are different things to maybe target and but there's multiple places and ways to promote. And we've talked about in-app. The other, I think that two of the ways that help podcasts the most are different kind of in-app features, in-app promotions.
Yeah.
We see it's very popular with our banners at Podbean, but
Yeah.
also promoting on other podcasts potentially. And we have a lot of people using our ads marketplace to run ads on, similarly themed kind of podcasts or podcasts that may have a
Yes.
similar audience. Because once again, just like you said before, that's where a podcast audience already lives.
Yes, that's where the
And
listeners
therefore they're,
are.
yeah, and they're like, oh, I love this podcast, but they're coming out once a week and I have 5 hours to listen. So I need, how do I find more stuff like this? And then if there's a nice promo on there about a similar type of podcast or something that's somewhat related, then they're ripe to just do a click and follow you. So there's many different things you can do to promote and to be out there. And one particular kind of category in one particular directory is not the end all be all to your success or failure. And it won't, and unfortunately, even though it has value, as we spoke about, it won't do everything for you. So
Right.
there have been,
Oh,
I've
yeah.
talked to several people who've been in New and Noteworthy, and the long tail of that for them was not much. So there was initial excitement. They're very glad they got in it, but if they assume that that's going to sort of do everything for them, and then they're not going to have to do any of the other
Right.
promotional work, it won't
Right.
it won't last. The fever won't last, So
Right, it's not
it's
sustainable because 'cause you're not gonna be new forever if you got featured because you're new or, a new season came out, and I just wanna backtrack a little bit and just reiterate what you were saying before about establishing your podcast and hosting. I just wanna drive that point home because it is so important, Shannon. When you set up a podcast and you're getting ready to launch, do not apply to directories the day that you want to launch the podcast. This is a common misconception. I just want to say this again because it's so important to know that podcast directories operate independently. And at Podbean, we host 600,000 podcasts, so quite a lot. But we don't have control over other directories' approval process or, what their staff looks like or even their anything like that. So we want to make sure that you have as much time as possible to set yourself up for success. And if it's, an Apple podcast or something that can take 24 hours, but even over the holidays, that number is what, a week or two. Make sure that you give yourself adequate time to make sure that you are established within a directory with your trailer episode or and your information before you launch. It's so important.
Yeah, because there's a lot of times, even though we give very specific instructions about how to submit to the different directories, and with Apple, there's
Yeah.
things about the artwork and stuff. But sometimes the artwork especially can be tricky sometimes on Apple. So you maybe thought that you had the specs right, but there's some kind of problem. And so, if you run into a problem, there's another delay. And so if you're
Yeah.
really specific on dates, then prepare ahead. Or, it's just like a restaurant opening. You can do a soft launch.
Right. No, I think it's important though, because if
So,
your podcast is an extension of your business or something else and it's part of a larger strategy, maybe for marketing a new product, you want to make sure that it's on point. So that's such an important point, Shannon. That's such an important aspect. So thank you again for bringing that up. Yeah, within the directories, it's incredibly important. And we've covered quite a lot today. I think one of the one of the other things that I wanna touch on that we spoke about before is that you can request to be featured. It isn't like, well, I guess it's like winning the lottery, right? You have to buy a ticket. And so it's something where if you wanna be featured by some of these podcasts, you've got to ask. You've got to put yourself out there. And we have some links in the show notes of this episode that we'll put up. And they really talk about, where you can go to apply to be featured within various directories, because it's something where, if you want to raise your hand, you have to apply. So that is such an important aspect. And we've talked a lot about, things we can all do, and kind of little things, but I want to talk a little bit more about what does work. um so maybe a little bit about podcast app SEO and how we can all benefit from making the most of that.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the most important thing currently with podcast apps, so it's very,
Yeah.
we call it SEO, but of course it's not SEO because they're not search engines. But
Right.
it's an
I
easy
guess
term
it's
to.
just SO, search
It's
optimization,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. PS podcast search optimization, PSO, I guess, podcast app. But anyway, regardless of that, of the name, for a podcast app in particular, really titles are key. A lot of them will search title and author tags, but author tags
Yeah.
you really can't. There's been a practice, a kind of shady practice in the past of people making their author name, stuffing a lot of things in there, like putting other people's names, putting guest names and stuff. So for the overall podcast, the rule with Apple, anyways, for the overall podcast, that author title is not supposed to be any of your guests or anything like that. I mean, it's supposed to be your
Yeah.
name. I think it could be like your name and title, but for the episodes, I think you could potentially have guest names in there. So Apple does include author as a way to search, which is nice because I may know Norma Jean Belinkie has a podcast, but I forget what the name of it is. So I could potentially find your podcast that way. So that's why that's included. But most people are going to search by titles or keywords to find it. So number one, focus on that. Number two, knowing general SEO, search engine optimization, is
Yeah.
really also something that's important. So for your podcast, Google can find someone can Google. I often do search for podcasts in Google, and not necessarily because I want to listen in Google Podcasts. I listen in Podbean, but I'm just looking for a
You
new
want to see the
topic.
show notes, you want to see the website of the podcaster, you want to
Yeah, or I'm
see any
just
additional. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Or I'm just looking for something on a specific topic that I don't know if there's any podcasts out there about,
Right.
and I'm not really sure. So Google is so good at that. Are there any podcasts on so and so incident or whatever? What are the best podcasts on whatever? And you'll get a lot of articles and different things like that. But so people do that. I'm not. I know I'm not alone in that. I ask for friends recommendations, but then I also turn to Google. So making sure you have a good podcast site. Podbean provides a podcast site, and there's a lot you can do with it. You can actually use your own domain. You can add a lot of content to it and stuff. So having a robust podcast website, whether that's again on your own or through a hosting company, and then if you don't know SEO, you could potentially outsource it, or you can do a little research to learn how do you make good quality posts that go with each of your
Yes.
episodes. So the thing is, transcripts are very useful for accessibility. They're not
Yes.
necessarily the best thing for SEO. The number one thing for SEO, it's just if you're a blogger or you've done websites, you know what an SEO post looks like. You've probably written a post. It's a very rich, information filled article on a specific topic. So Google wants to see that it's relevant. They want to see that the keywords are used, but not stuffed, not tricky, and that's really
Yeah.
on that topic. Same thing if you write a post for a podcast episode, it's very similar. It can be very keyword driven. Your titles are also important in Google, but subheadings and all of that. So writing, if you have the bandwidth, that's
Yeah.
another whole thing. You're recording a podcast. Now you have to write a post, but that's the number one recommendation if you're able to do it, to write a sort of a long form kind of blog post with each podcast episode. Second to that is you can write sort of a shorter, more of like a summary. A transcript can be a good option if you feel like there's no bandwidth and you're not really going to be able to do a written out post. A transcript is definitely better than literally having nothing about the episode, having no words.
Yeah.
Um, that's a better, but in a transcript, there's a lot of filler. That's why it's not quite as good for Google, but it's excellent for accessibility. So I still highly recommend them. And we have that option now in Podbean for transcripts and closed captioning. And then if your show notes, if you just have the title and no other information, or you just have a couple of links or whatever, and you don't do kind of a longer form post, then that's going to be the least searchable by any kind of, non-podcast search engine. So the more kind of contextual information you have there, the better the keyword optimizing. So podcast SO, whatever we want to call it, podcast SO
Yeah.
is one thing really important for that. And then Google type of search engine optimization is another thing. If you have the bandwidth to do that, it certainly can be
Yeah.
worth it, building out the website. So
Absolutely. And
those
when
are
we
kind of,
say, oh,
go ahead,
sorry, Shannon.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just
Sorry.
saying, in terms of when we say bandwidth, we mean personal bandwidth.
Yes,
So that's a
yes,
term we
exactly.
use all the time in Podbean because as podcasters, we can all just really easily overwhelm ourselves, and burnout, or as we call it in the industry, pod fade is real. So when
Yep,
we say bandwidth, it's a term that one of our colleagues has. It's personal bandwidth, and that means what you
yes,
are capable of, perform with the level that you're capable of performing at or creating at
yep,
consistently and sustainably, and
yes.
within your mental and physical health and well-being.
Yeah, because it's a little, I'm glad you clarified that because of course there's actual bandwidth in podcasting.
Right.
So that it can be confusing when I throw that out there. But yeah, what you're able to do. So, I mean, I'm telling you what's ideal, but I know you
Yeah.
may not be able to record a good episode, schedule guests, get good quality, and also write blog posts for them all. But maybe it becomes worthwhile over time, or you outsource it, or
Yeah.
you kind of have to figure that out. And maybe you do a shorter post in the meantime, or use a transcript because it's more
Yeah.
feasible for you. So I can say kind of, okay, here's the ideal recommendations for search engines.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that it's going to work for everyone. And if you're going to have to sacrifice, the content of your podcast and the quality, then obviously don't sacrifice it to try to be searched for, because if your stuff's not good, it doesn't matter. So that's kind of, it doesn't, if people find you and then they don't like it, it won't
You're
go
just
anywhere in
not
the
the
long
not
run.
the right audience. So thank you so much, Shannon, because I really want to sum up what we've been talking about today. So the number one thing is to make sure your podcast is in the directories that you want to be featured in, whether it's Podbean, whether it's Apple Podcasts. Make sure that you are hosted uh, with your host, and you distribute. Sorry, make sure that your host distributes to those directories, and that you have applied, and your RSS feed is plugged in to those podcast directories. So that's number one. Really adhere to their guidelines. Make sure that you're utilizing the guidelines that they provide to your greatest advantage. Make sure your content has the best quality that you can provide for your niche and prospective audience. Um, in terms of best practices, I think that's a really big one. Make sure your artwork really fits with your podcast and is eye catching and really fits the theme. Same with your title. Make sure it's searchable. Make sure that your show notes and maybe transcript and the way that you present your podcast in the description is important as well. And then last but not least, request to be featured. So, put your hand up and apply. So that's a really big aspect as well. And for anybody who'd like more information, we have quite a few links. I think 4 we're popping in the show notes here. So I think we'll end it today. Shannon Martin, our Director of Communications, thank you so much. My name is Norma Jean Belenke. I'm the head of events here at Podbean, and this has been New and Noteworthy: Hacking the Algorithm of Podcast Directories, presented by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetization company and home to over 600,000 podcasts. If you want to learn more or start a podcast yourself, check us out at podbean.com. Thank you all so much for joining, and the replay will be available on the Podcasting Smarter channel, the Podcasting Smarter podcast here on YouTube and LinkedIn. And if anybody has any questions or wants to get in contact, please reach out to us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Thank you all so much, and have a great day.